Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 5 of the Liberation Library Book Reviews here on the Liberty Weekly podcast. As always, I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane. This episode, entitled The Emerging American Police State, will be available in both audio and video formats on my BitChute and YouTube channels. Likewise, the audio and video versions of this podcast will be embedded along with the show notes on my website at libertyweekly.net/LL5. That is the letters LL and the number 5. Patreon supporters will also have access to the complete and hyperlinked transcript of this episode. In this episode of the Liberation Library Book Reviews, I will be tackling John W. Whitehead's book, A Government of Wolves, The Emerging American Police State. And let me just say that you better buckle up because I'm about to unleash a proverbial fire hose of information at you. Let's get to it. So as we can see here on his About Us page at the Rutherford Institute, John W. Whitehead is a constitutional law attorney and civil libertarian who, quote, gained international renown as a result of his role as co-counsel in Paula Jones's sexual harassment lawsuit against President Bill Clinton. His concern for civil liberties led him to establish the Rutherford Institute, pictured here for video viewers of the podcast, which is a nonprofit civil liberties and human rights organization located in Charlottesville, Virginia. In addition to penning a weekly column on the Rutherford Institute's website, www.rutherford.org, John Whitehead is also a contributor at newsbud.com, where he hosts a bi-monthly video podcast series entitled Battlefield America. For those of my listeners who aren't familiar with newsbud.com, the site offers top-notch independent journalism from a dream team of experts like John W. Whitehead, FBI whistleblower Sibel Edmonds, former InfoWars editor Kurt Nemo, and many others listed here. My favorite was MindHack with Jeff Dorizo, although I'm not seeing him here currently. But for those curious, I will definitely include a link in the show notes page. But please note that the subscription fee is present and can be a little pricey for someone on a student's budget, such as myself. But turning now to the book itself, I did find it amusing that Whitehead presents the subject matter with the same vision that I had for my Thought Crime Thursdays segment, and that is to use the world of popular dystopian fiction to resonate with the American public on familiar grounds, and to illustrate how dystopian fiction films are actually revealing truths about the current paradigm that we live in. And obviously, because I myself have utilized or taken the same route towards trying to illustrate these problems, I believe that John W. Whitehead's book should resonate with the American public. That being said, this is one of the most alarming and depressing books that I've ever read, and I really don't think that the average American sheeple would appreciate being made this uncomfortable. But if there is any way to actually reach the American people, it should be through the use of dystopian fiction and popular works of fiction. And in fact, I find it a bit ironic that Americans and the general public can watch and exalt these dystopian fiction films without stopping to examine the walls of their own cage. And I believe that is a cage that, as we'll see throughout this podcast, has almost completely and totally enveloped the public. Now, in getting to the meat of this book review, I'm going to highlight the general themes that Whitehead discusses in his book, and also provide some background along with my own commentary. The first theme discussed in John W. Whitehead's book is the difference between the overtly brutalist totalitarianism of George Orwell's 1984 and the mesmerizing, relatively seductive society that is presented in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And longtime listeners of the podcast will remember that I did touch on this dichotomy in episode 29 of the podcast, entitled Stoned Apes and Brave New World, which I would certainly recommend you check out at libertyweekly.net/29. But to illustrate this difference, I wanted to start off with a few video segments, the first one coming from the film adaptation of George Orwell's 1984.
Do you remember writing in your diary, "Freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4.
Yes.
How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?
4.
And if the party says there are not 4, but 5, then how many?
5.
No. That's no use. You're lying. How many fingers, please?
4. What else could I say? cry for, anything you like. Only please stop it. Stop the pain. How can I help it? How can I help what I see under my eyes? 2 and 2 makes 4.
Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they're 5. Sometimes they're 3. Sometimes they're all of them at once. Neither the past, nor the present, nor the future exists in its own right, Winston. Reality is in the human mind, not in the individual mind, which makes mistakes and soon perishes, but in the mind of the party.
So in this scene, we see Winston being tortured into accepting that the state controls reality. And this is, in effect, the overtly violent crushing of the individual, who is then subsumed by the collectivity of society. And to do this, the state overtly manipulates history, language, and news in a panoptic surveillance state until there is nothing left but the state itself and its dictates. And Murray Rothbard has a lot to say about exalting the collectivity of society, because in the past, specifically within the legal sphere, and that's what I talk about usually, is if a crime is seen to be against society instead of against the individual, then the state can get away with making crimes of things that have no victim. And that is how we get things like drug laws and seatbelt laws, you name it. But in contrast to the brutalist scene that we just witnessed here, Huxley presents a similar yet different vision that I think is also compelling. Let's take a look at what he has to say.
But as I think it was Metternich said many years ago, you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you are going to control any population for any length of time, you must have some measure of consent. It's exceedingly difficult to see how pure terrorism can function indefinitely. It can function for a fairly long time, but I think sooner or later you have to bring in an element of persuasion, an element of getting people to consent to what is happening to them. Well, it seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. This is, seems to me, the ultimate in malevolent revolution, shall we say.
So as you just heard, Huxley's vision of a dystopian world comes in stark contrast to the world that George Orwell would posit. And while both versions of a dystopian future are illustrative of our current situation, I do tend to think that Huxley is a little more correct. I think it is much easier and cost-efficient to control the masses of people through propaganda, distractions, conditioning, pharmacology, clandestine surveillance, and an us versus them propaganda mentality. And I do want to stress that I truly do think that Americans love their servitude, which is a truly impressive feat, seeing that our founding, while not 100% pure, was generally speaking that of a grassroots libertarian uprising. And for more of that, I would see Prof. CJ's series on the American Revolution, linked in the show notes page below. But I think that we can see that Americans really do love their servitude, and this is illustrated by the left's paternalism and things like "not my president." On the right, I think it is most apparent with police and military worship. And I do think that the fundamental cause of this is that somewhere in our history, probably through public schooling, Americans became convinced that their natural rights are provided by or exist because of the state. Even though I believe that Huxley's vision of the future is a little more accurate than Orwell's, that does not mean that Orwell is incorrect. And I think that we can see Orwell's brutalist future reflected in how the American government deals with dissent and secures compliance to its mandates. And that is through police militarization, which is the next big theme of Whitehead's book, and which will correspondingly be the highlight of the first half of this podcast. And for an excellent introduction on the issue of police militarization, I'm going to be turning to the Learn Liberty YouTube channel.
The trend of police militarization is something that people really talk about starting to happen in the 1960s. I think there were some trends prior to that, but it didn't really take off like it did until you hit really Vietnam and then war on drugs. And that actually is one of the things that we talk about in looking at and linking up foreign policy to domestic consequences. SWAT teams are probably one of the best examples. SWAT teams are now something that pretty much any moderately sized police department has. So if you have a town of 50,000 or more people, chances are you have got a SWAT team. So Special Weapons and Tactics teams, also referred to as police paramilitary units or PPUs. So the fact you've got the word military in there, I think is fairly pointed. But where did those come from? We actually know exactly where they came from. You have two people who are generally considered responsible for SWAT teams, Daryl Gates and John Nelson. So John Nelson was a former Marine, Vietnam veteran. He was part of the elite force recon unit. So this unit was tasked with going deep behind enemy lines, and despite having the name reconnaissance in the title, they were actually a very effective killing force. They engaged the enemy, I think it was something 90% of the time, which was incredibly high. And he came back, joined the LAPD, and you have the Watts riots. And looking at these race riots, he goes to his boss, so Inspector Daryl Gates, who's a World War II veteran, and says, hey, I have an idea of how we might be able to better control crowds. And he suggests modeling a unit after these recon units that he'd been a part of in Vietnam. And so Gates likes this idea, runs with it, and what was originally supposed to be called the Special Weapons and Attack Team, but it was thought attack was politically unpalatable, SWAT team was born. It's modeled after that particular unit. According to the LAPD history, every member of the original SWAT unit had prior military training. They were interested in, and if you read Gates' biography, he talks about watching what was happening in Vietnam, getting training from the military. And so you start to see these kinds of very intimate connections that are happening between police and the military. And they're interested in using not only those mentalities that they've cultivated abroad, but they're also interested in using those technologies that they've developed.
How do we, well, if you had your druthers, would these things just not exist at all? Like policing would just be purely the way it was before all this?
So policing historically in the United States has been distinct from the military. So if you look at the Constitution, if you look at laws that came after that, probably the big one that people point to was enacted right after the Civil War called the Posse Comitatus Act. And
I don't even know that one.
So
what's that one?
Posse Comitatus literally translates to
Sounds good.
Force of the people. And so the purpose of this law was to separate police from the military. So military could not be used as a civilian police force. Pretty much as soon as the ink is dry, this thing is getting violated. It's getting suspended in, I think, World War I, World War II. Then there are a series of court cases in the 1970s that pretty much take any kind of sticking power that this thing had to begin with completely out of it. And so you see this big blurring of these lines. In addition to things like SWAT teams, which comes within this time period, the war on drugs and the war on terror are particularly important because you see that continued interconnectivity between domestic law enforcement agencies and what the federal government is doing. So now you have police departments who, instead of having their job, which has historically been to be peacekeepers, uphold domestic law, protecting the rights of citizens, both individuals who are the perpetrators of crime and the victims of crime. Instead of serving that function, they are now on, quote unquote, the front lines of two perpetual wars, the war on drugs and the war on terror, which are different from other conflicts that we've seen before. Because if you think about Vietnam or one of the world wars, the enemy is very clearly defined and external to the United States. But with the war on drugs, you not only have things like South American cartels, but you have people who are domestically manufacturing, selling, and consuming drugs who are enemies of this war. There's been a big emphasis on homegrown terrorism. And so now your police departments are tasked with another job that is not part of their job description. And so it's been a building and a combination of all of these things that I think has really contributed to this police militarization, which now I think a lot of people are more aware of.
So in addition to that stellar introduction by Professor Abby Hall, police militarization is actually something that I've covered in the podcast before in my first email subscriber ebook entitled, quote, Just Say No to Drug Prohibition, which video viewers of the show see here on screen. And in this paper, aside from detailing why, economically speaking, prohibition is a disastrous policy that produces more drug addiction, governmental corruption, dangerous alternatives, and perverse economic incentives, I recount the shocking history of surplus military weapons and equipment being tested abroad and funneled back to domestic police agencies. And I'll recount that history by reading an excerpt from my paper here. As a result of the war in Vietnam, opiate use among returning servicemen was feared to be exploding. Likewise, it was feared that the war was causing a massive uptick to the supply of opiates in the U.S. market. Despite allegations that the CIA itself was heavily involved in East Asian opium trafficking to the United States during the Vietnam War, President Nixon declared the war on drugs on June 17th, 1971, naming illegal drug use as, quote, public enemy number one in the United States. This announcement was coupled with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which gave powers to the FDA and the newly formed DEA to classify drugs on a 5-category classification basis. It was not until the rise of Ronald Reagan, however, that these policies would be given more teeth. Throughout the 1980s, Reagan used support from Congress to roll out gaping drug enforcement exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act, we see mentioned by Professor Abby Hall, which is, again, a piece of Civil War-era legislation that prohibited military involvement in matters of civilian policing. Under Reagan, drugs were to become an issue of national security, an issue which required the assistance of federal agencies and the National Guard. These policies came as a monumental shift in domestic policy, yet were passed without much opposition or public debate. Very quietly, the war on drugs took quite a literal meaning. Now, throughout the 80s and 90s, police departments across the country took full advantage of the new federal policies, and these are some old statistics, but nonetheless, I think they are shocking. Quote, between just 1995 and 1997, the Pentagon distributed 3,800 M16s, 2,185 M14s, 73 grenade launchers, and 112 armored personnel carriers to civilian police agencies around the country. And for my source material in this paper, I heavily quoted Radley Balco's article, which I will cite in the show notes page as well. But that one, I think, was called The War Comes Home, or something such like that. But furthermore, quote, in 1997 alone, the Pentagon handed over more than 1.2 million pieces of military equipment to local police departments. This wave of military aid to civilian police agencies was just the beginning. In order to further streamline the transfer of military equipment and training to civilian police agencies, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Security Act of 1997 that created the Law Enforcement Support Program headquartered in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. This program was meant to facilitate the transfer of military equipment to civilian police agencies. As a result, quote, between January 1997 and October 1999, the agency handled 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment from over 11,000 domestic police agencies in all 50 states. By December 2005, the number was up to 17,000. The National Journal reported that this glut of equipment included, quote, 253 aircraft, including 6 and 7 passenger airplanes and UH-60 Black Hawk and UH-1 Huey helicopters, 7,856 M16s, 181 grenade launchers, 8,131 bulletproof helmets, and 1,161 pairs of night vision goggles. What is even more alarming is the specific range of military arms that certain departments received. The LAPD, for instance, was offered an outfit of bayonets. What are they going to use those for? A retired police chief in New Haven, Connecticut, told reporters that, quote, he was offered tanks, bazookas, anything he wanted. Across the country, 90% of cities with populations above 50,000 had at least one paramilitary police unit, double the amount from the mid-'80s. Small towns across the country became outfitted with grenade launchers, APCs, and assault rifles. SWAT teams began sprouting up all over the country, many of them in small towns. Quote, as of 1996, 65% of towns within the 25,000 to 50,000 population range had a SWAT team, with another 8% planning to form one. Now, according to the LAPD, the entity that first developed SWAT teams, the program, as we heard from Professor Abby Hall, was created as a response to mass shooting events which gained nationwide attention in the 1960s. Later on, they were used in delicate hostage situations, mass shooting scenarios, and to quell civil unrest. For the situations in which they were intended, SWAT teams can be a necessary tool to protect the public. However, these situations are relatively rare compared to what these groups are asked to do today. The new policies filled rural and metropolitan areas alike to the brim with paramilitary police groups equipped with high-tech, battle-ready military equipment. SWAT teams, which were created to solve delicate, high-pressure situations, did not have much to do in places like Jackson County, Wisconsin, my home state, current population 20,500, where volatile, barricading hostage-type situations were already happening less and less, according to the local SWAT captain. As a result, SWAT teams across the country were used to execute routine search warrants and perform drug arrests. And there was reason to do so, too, because federal grant money through programs like the Burn Justice Assistance Grant Program awarded police in Jackson County, Wisconsin, approximately $153 for each drug arrest made. Consequently, departments in Jackson County took full advantage of these incentives, quadrupling its federal funding between 1999 and 2000. In 1 year, departments all across the country began taking advantage of these programs after that. It was even discovered that police departments in Florida manipulated their own crime statistics in order to receive more funding and more equipment. And I believe that it would be folly to assume that these practices were merely isolated incidents. Need I reiterate here that the Founding Fathers understood the role that standing armies played in suppressing liberty. In his seminal piece, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, Bernard Bailyn writes, quote, this fear of standing armies followed directly from the colonists' understanding of power and of human nature. On purely logical grounds, it was a reasonable fear, but it went beyond mere logic. Only too evident was it justified as the colonists saw it by history and by the facts of the contemporary world. Conclusive examples of what happened when standing armies were permitted to dominate communities were constantly before their minds' eyes. Furthermore, Bernard Bailyn explains later in that work how, influenced by the writings of Thomas Jefferson, Josiah Quincy, John Trenchard, and others, the colonists' contempt for British occupation played a substantial role in instigating the American Revolution. With this historical parallel, it is not difficult to see how police policy, made necessary for the enforcement of drug prohibition, may lead to violence. I also wanted to impress the fact that, coupled with the war on terror, the war on drugs provides the biggest impetus for the government to violate our Fourth Amendment protections. And consequently, since the beginning of the war on drugs and prohibition, we have seen the Fourth Amendment be eviscerated for utilitarian purposes. And here I have Hyen v. State of North Carolina, actually here on the Rutherford Institute for viewers of the video podcast. But John W. Whitehead goes through the decision in Hyen v. North Carolina, which basically says that even though a police officer might have a mistake or mistake the laws, the evidence won't be excluded from the trial if the officer's mistaken understanding of the law was quote-unquote reasonable, and if the government receives a bigger benefit from the evidence being admitted, then the Fourth Amendment violation is destructive to Fourth Amendment protections. And this is the kind of utilitarian crap that will eventually destroy the Fourth Amendment, what is left of it anyways. And I think it might go without saying that if the police did not have the justification of searching for drugs or searching for terrorism, there would be no reason for them to go through all of our possessions, our car, our home, everything, our electronic devices. What else would they be looking for but evidence of a crime with a victim? And if the police were actually looking for something that was linked to a crime with a victim, then I think it would be easier to preserve justice. But this mechanism and the supercharging of Fourth Amendment violations justified by searching for drugs or searching for terror is the machination which is eviscerating the Fourth Amendment. Now, before we move on to the next topic, I wanted to leave the audience with one statistic that John Whitehead always quotes, and that is that there are 80,000 SWAT team raids per year in the United States. Just think about that. That is 220 raids per day happening in the United States. And to regular listeners of the podcast, I don't think it's necessary to recount all the instances of SWAT team raids gone wrong, but there are many. And just recently, we see the one where the Call of Duty players were swatting each other, and the SWAT team showed up to the wrong house and shot an innocent man in the head and killed him. So there are plenty of that to go around, and it's just too much to cover in this podcast. And for your viewing pleasure, I have documented how exactly, legally speaking, police officers are held to a different legal standard through qualified and governmental immunity, but I would commend to the listener or the viewer this episode, Police Have No Duty to Protect You, The Truth About Warren v. District of Columbia, episode 46. That can be found at libertyweekly.net/46. Now, in this book, John Whitehead doesn't touch on another very important part of the American police state, but I just had to include a little segment on it, and that is the abuse of civil asset forfeiture, where police can use seized property to fund their departments, and in many cases, you don't even have to be convicted of a crime, just suspected, and many people will lose their property indefinitely and will never get it back. And in a lot of cases, if you drive around and see police departments using unmarked squad cars on the back that say, oh, this used to belong to a drug dealer, well, I think that's just ridiculous. I mean, if that isn't theft, I don't know what is. So let's learn a little bit about civil asset forfeiture.
Philadelphia, the birthplace of the Constitution, is home to one of the largest property rights battles in the nation. Welcome to the forfeiture machine. Civil forfeiture is when police and prosecutors seize property they suspect is connected to a crime. If you are charged with a crime, the government must prove your guilt and provide you an attorney if you can't afford one. But in the upside-down world of civil forfeiture, it's your property that gets charged, and you must prove that it isn't guilty. You must pay for a lawyer or go it alone. And if the police and prosecutors win, they get to keep the property for their own use, giving them the incentive to take as much as possible. Nowhere is the civil forfeiture machine more active than in Philadelphia. Each year, the city takes the cash, cars, and even homes of thousands of its citizens who have not been convicted of a crime. Meet Jackie. Jackie lives in a modest house with her 3 grandchildren. One day, the police arrested Jackie's oldest grandson outside her home for selling a small amount of marijuana. There were no drugs inside, and Jackie has never been in trouble with the law. Yet Philadelphia now wants to forfeit and sell Jackie's home. The letter tells Jackie that to save her home, she must come to courtroom 478. When Jackie arrives, she sees no judge, no jury, just a court scheduler and the prosecutors running the show. When Jackie asks if she needs an attorney, the prosecutor replies, "No, your case isn't complicated," and hands her a long questionnaire to fill out. After Jackie finishes, the prosecutor orders her to return in a month. When Jackie comes back, the prosecutor orders her to bring her bank records. The month after that, the prosecutor orders her to kick out her grandson. Property owners are forced to return as many as 12 times before they even see a judge. If they miss a single hearing, they lose their property forever. After nearly a year, the prosecutor asks Jackie if she wants to settle by agreeing to give up her home in exchange for half the sales price. Worn down, Jackie reluctantly accepts. It's not fair. It's not right. But there's no telling when this nightmare will end. Jackie is not alone. In over a decade, Philadelphia's forfeiture machine took more than 1,100 homes. That's more than 20 times all other counties in Pennsylvania combined. Altogether, Philadelphia collected $64 million in forfeiture proceeds. Shockingly, Philadelphia used almost half of that money for salaries, including the salaries of the very prosecutors doing the forfeiting. Philadelphia's forfeiture machine is unconscionable and unconstitutional. That's why the Institute for Justice has sued Philadelphia in federal court to end these abusive forfeiture practices and to stop the city's police and prosecutors from treating its citizens like ATM machines. Click here to help tear down Philadelphia's forfeiture machine and restore liberty.
So in tandem with civil asset forfeiture, which I think, in my opinion, is blatant piracy, John W. Whitehead talks a lot about the prison industrial complex, which as libertarians, we know that prisons are filled with nonviolent drug offenders, and disproportionately the United States jails more people than any other nation in the world. And I think that that's deplorable, but a lot has been talked about that already in the media. But I will simply just assert that private prisons are not private prisons. They are funded entirely by a government-created market, and they also receive regulation breaks and tax subsidies from the government. But to illustrate this point, I'm going to hand it over to Ron Paul.
You know, it's interesting you talk about the prison industrial complex in your article, and I think, you know, your article captures a lot of these issues very well. And I was looking before we spoke today about some statistics on this, the privatization of prisons. And it's amazing if you look at a 700% spike in the U.S. prison population in the last few decades, 1,600% growth in the private prison industry. And the other thing that I think is probably even more key than that is I noticed that the top 3 private prisons have spent $45 million on campaign donations and lobbying, I think, in the past few years. So this is an industry that that carries a lot of weight.
Yeah. And it's an industry that makes nothing but misery. One of the things you talk about here in the realm of what is called private imprisonment, private incarceration, is what you described, Daniel, as an iron triangle here in terms of the way that the lobbying works out, the way that profits are privatized here and costs are socialized. But you're not talking about private prisons, you're talking about corporatist prisons, where people are making private profits out of a public function that really has no place in a free society.
So moving on, another theme that Whitehead expresses concern for is the rise of quote-unquote non-lethal compliance weapons that actually are lethal in some situations. And he argues that the use of these quote-unquote non-lethal compliance weapons that are very barbaric, I think, in some situations, actually means that they will be used with impunity because those using them perceive that they are non-lethal.
Now, there's a whole range of different sorts of non-lethal weapons, some of which are obviously available now, some of which they're developing. So you've got traditional things like pepper spray, OC spray up the top there, or tasers over here. The one on the top right here is actually a dazzling laser intended to just blind the person momentarily and disorient them. You've got non-lethal shotgun rounds that contain rubber pellets instead of the traditional metal ones. And this one in the middle here, the large truck, is actually called the active denial system, something the US military is working on at the moment. It's essentially a big microwave transmitter. It's sort of your classic idea of a heat ray. It goes out to a really long distance compared to any of these other sorts of things, and anybody who is hit with this feels this sudden burst of heat and just wants to get out of the way. It is a lot more sophisticated than a microwave oven, but it basically is boiling the water molecules in the very surface level of your skin. So you feel this massive heat and you go, I want to get out of the way. And they're thinking, well, this will be really useful in places like where we need to clear a crowd out of a particular area if the crowd is being hostile, if we need to keep people away from a particular place, well, we can do that with these sorts of things. So obviously there's a whole range of different sorts of non-lethal weapons we could give military personnel, and there's a whole range of situations where they're looking at them and saying, hey, these things would be really useful. But as I said, the military and the police are very different. Yes, you don't have to look very hard at this to recognise the fact that they might be very different. But they don't ever get used like that. They get used out in the real world, like in Texas, like this. I confess this particular case was actually one that piqued my interest in this. It happened while I was working as a research fellow at the US Naval Academy, and news reports started coming up about this situation where this woman was arguing with the police officer. She wasn't violent. In fact, he was probably 6 inches taller than me and she was about this tall. And eventually she said to him, well, you know, I'm going to get back in my car. And he says, if you get back in your car, I'm going to tase you. And she says, oh, go ahead, tase me. And so he does. Yeah, and it's all captured by the video camera running in the front of the police car. So, you know, she's 72. And it's seen that this is the most appropriate way of dealing with her. And other examples of the same sorts of things with other people where you think, well, is this really an appropriate way to use non-lethal weapons? Yeah. Police chief fires taser into 14-year-old girl's head. She was running away. What else was I supposed to do? Or Florida. Police taser 6-year-old boy at elementary school. And they clearly learnt a lot from it because in the same district, police reviewed policy after children shocked. Second child shocked by taser stun gun within weeks. Same police district. Another child within weeks of tasering the 6-year-old boy. Just in case you're thinking it's only going to happen in the United States, it happened in Canada as well. And a colleague of mine sent me this one from London. But my personal favourite of these ones, I have to confess, does actually come from the United States. Officers taser 86-year-old disabled woman in her bed. I checked the reports on this one. I looked at it. I was really surprised. Apparently, she took up a more threatening position in her bed. I kid you not. That's exactly what it said. She took up a more threatening position in her bed. Okay.
Malika Brooks, 33 years old, 7 months pregnant, was driving her 11-year-old child to school when she was pulled over for allegedly speeding. The police told her she'd been speeding and gave her a speeding ticket. And she looked at the speeding ticket and the cop said, you have to sign the back of the ticket. Well, she said, that will be admitting guilt. I really can't do that. I'll take the ticket, but I can't sign it. The policeman said, you either sign the ticket, lady, or I may have to take you to jail. She refused. The first cop called a second cop in who told her that if she didn't sign the ticket, she would go to jail. A third policeman was called in as backup at that point, who told her if she did not sign the ticket, she would be tasered. He showed her the gun, flipped it around like a cowboy, showed her how it would stun her. She grabbed the steering wheel, stood her ground, refused to sign the ticket. She informed them, she said, I'm pregnant. In 60 days, I'm going to give birth to a kid. The cop said, well, we're going to have to taser you if you don't get out of the car. We're taking you to jail. She held onto the steering wheel. At that point, the three cops actually discussed in front of her what they were going to do to her. They said, where should we taser her? First, all of a sudden, they tasered her in the thigh, they tasered her in the side, and then they tasered her in the neck. She falls out of the car onto the pavement at that point. They push her face down and put handcuffs on her back, pick up this pregnant woman, and take her to jail. Well, this lady wasn't going to let this stand, so she went all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, arguing that this was excessive force, and these cops, she said, should give her some damages for what they did to her, violating her rights, tasering her for a minor speeding violation. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled, yes, this is excessive force, but they ruled the police have qualified immunity, even when they use excessive force against American citizens. They can't be fined, they can't be in any way reprimanded. She then appealed to the Supreme Court, and as you might expect, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case and let it stand. Being tasered is no light thing. For example, watch this scene here of someone being tasered. Taser. Incredibly, since the year 2001, over 500 people have died from being tased by the police. In a 2008 report, Amnesty International reviewed hundreds of deaths following taser use and found that 90% of those who died after being struck with a taser were unarmed. In late 2007, the United Nations Committee Against Torture declared that the use of tasers constituted a form of torture. More and more people are being tasered. Let me give you a few examples of people who have been tasered. In Florida, a 15-year-old girl was tasered after being taken off a bus following a disturbance. In Arizona, a runaway 9-year-old girl was tased as she sat in the back seat of a police car with her hands cuffed behind her back. In Oregon, police tased a blind and partially deaf 71-year-old multiple times in her own front yard. In another instance, a Florida woman, 12 weeks pregnant, was tased after refusing to submit to a strip search at the jail. She spontaneously miscarried 7 days later. In Texas, a 72-year-old great-grandmother was tased after refusing to sign a speeding ticket. Yet despite all the evidence, the police are using tasers more and more. In fact, the tasers are getting more streamlined and more invasive. There's now the X12 taser shotgun, which can shoot tasers from a distance. And actually, when this thing enters your body, if it hits you, it's got little fins like a guided missile. It actually sticks you in the chest, breaks in two, and tasers you again. What needs to be done? Obviously, there needs to be a moratorium placed on tasers. If they're so-called non-lethal weapons, then they need to find a way to make them non-lethal. As we know, many people have died from using tasers. The ACLU, in a study in New York, has found that they're being increasingly used on unarmed people who are just arguing, and things like that. So, in my opinion, tasers should be outlawed at this point until we find a way that they can be used safely. If they can't, then they should not be used at all.
Okay, so there I included some very concerning information about the use of quote-unquote non-lethal weapons. I was actually pleasantly surprised to find a section on this in John W. Whitehead's book, because I think it's an issue that we don't usually talk about. And there are lots and lots of police victims who have gone through and suffered and died, actually, from the use of quote-unquote non-lethal compliance devices. And like I said, I think the danger with this is that police will think that these weapons are non-lethal, so therefore they won't be restrained in using them on people. And as you can see, they've used them on children and grandparents. And there was a clip that I was going to include where they were torturing a young boy in a prison cell by strapping him to a compliance chair and repeatedly tasering him for 3 hours, the lawsuit said. And the video footage of that, which I didn't include, is very horrendous and disturbing. And it looks like something out of the CIA Abu Ghraib torture prisons in the Middle East. Not something that you would see in a free society, quote unquote, a free society. So to this point in the podcast, we have discussed the brutalist Orwellian ways that the American police state controls society and suppresses dissent. Now I want to tackle where Orwell meets Huxley, and that is through mainstream media lies and propaganda. And through hilarious serendipity, I discovered this meme earlier from my buddy Steven at the Anarcho-Christian Facebook page, which I should include a link in the show notes page in the episode here. But this is from CNN Politics talking about Donald Trump's tweet. And for those in the listening to the audio version of this podcast only, I'll read it. It says, "The tweet was remarkable, not just for its content, but for the fact that it was generated by a president, the holder of the office that for decades has been the effective guarantor of a U.S.-enforced 70-year era of global peace." Yeah, that's CNN in the current day and age in 2018. And there's a little quote at the bottom from George Orwell, which is very obviously pertinent to this podcast here today. But it says, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." And obviously, we've seen quite a bit of mainstream media lies manipulating history in real time, which I will present just the tip of the iceberg here.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass death.
The intelligence that we were operating off was correct.
The quality of our intelligence operation, I think we're better than anybody else.
We gathered a lot of intelligence. That intelligence was good, sound intelligence.
But we now know that Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Among other sources, we've gotten this from first-hand testimony from defectors, including Saddam's own son-in-law.
Delay in decision and inaction could lead to a massive and sudden horror.
It simply makes no sense to wait any longer.
Take action before it's too late.
We will not wait.
As President Bush has said, time is not on our side.
I still thought that 3.5 months for new inspections was a rather short time before cooling a day, and especially when we now see that they say, the U.S. government is saying that, look, you have to have a bit of patience, you know, these things take time.
If someone is waiting for a so-called smoking gun, it's certain that we will have waited too long.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
It's hard to know exactly what's happening in Syria right now. I'd like to know specifically how that release of chemical gas, if it did occur, and it looks like it did, how that occurred. Because frankly, I don't think Assad would have done that. It does not serve his interests. It would tend to draw us into that civil war even further.
Who do you think is behind it? Who do you think is behind it?
You know, you've got a war going on over there. Supposedly that airstrike was on an ammo dump. And so I don't know if it was released because there was gas stored in the ammo dump or not. That's plausible. I'm not saying that's what I think happened, but
You're more inclined to believe the position of what Bashar al-Assad is saying and what the Russians are saying right now than more inclined to believe what even your colleagues here in the United States believe is truth, that this is Assad, and what human rights observers over there say is Assad?
I don't think it would have served Assad's purposes to do a chemical attack on his people. So it's hard for me to understand why he would do that if he did.
Congressman Tom Massey, thanks for your time.
So, this recent statement from the White House alleging that the Syrian government was planning an upcoming chemical attack. Are you concerned that that could have created an opening for terrorist groups to carry out a chemical attack?
No.
You're not concerned, even though al-Nusra, al-Qaeda groups have been using chemical weapons in Syria? That's documented?
No. Next question on Syria.
Well, I mean, they could carry out a chemical attack, and then with the White House saying, oh, Assad was going to do it, that would create a cover for them to do such a thing.
Do I have to do this again? We know that Assad has used chemical weapons on his own people, and he's done that repeatedly.
Well, hasn't the United States convinced the world that
including women and children, and we have all seen that. We have all seen the video, and there is no debate about that. Okay.
So
I'm going to.
Assad give up his chemical weapons in 2013?
No.
Didn't that happen?
No.
That didn't happen, so the
let's go over to you. Anything else on Syria? Yeah.
Said before, are you saying that al-Qaeda has not used chemical weapons?
I'm not going to get into this conversation with you about this because no. You want to have a debate, okay, about a hypothetical. Okay, and I'm not going to get into a debate.
That there's a pending chemical attack,
I'm not going to get into a debate about a hypothetical.
But if you announce that, then they could carry out an attack, and it would look like the government did it. I mean, isn't that a real possibility?
If you want to try to make excuses for the Assad regime, go right ahead. You've
Assad,
got a lot of cameras on you right
groups.
now.
I'm talking about al-Qaeda.
Okay, and I'm not going to spend all our folks' time having that conversation. We all know here in this room that Bashar al-Assad is responsible for chemical attacks on his own people, including women and children. We are not going to debate it beyond that. Al-Qaeda, horrible too, but what we're talking about right now is Assad and Syria.
Well, I asked you about al-Qaeda.
Next
That's
question.
what I was asking for clarification.
Something else on Syria?
The Russian Ministry of Defense says that in Aleppo there was recently a chemical weapons attack and that it was conducted by the Harakat Nur al-Zenki organization, which is an opposition group that has received support from the United States. Is the United States still supporting this organization?
So unaware of that allegation. The only thing I'm aware of is the alleged chemical weapons attack on the town of Syria. I think we're talking about separate incidents. If I'm correct, I don't know.
I'm referring to something in Aleppo.
You're talking about something in Aleppo. So haven't seen those reports. Obviously, as we said with the incident that took place, I think 2 days ago, allegedly, there were reports of chemical weapons being used in another town. But the same would hold true with this. Is obviously we condemn strongly the use of any chemical weapons, and any credible allegations of their use in Syria will investigate. And I believe it's the purview of the OPCW that would carry out such an investigation. As to your follow-on question about this group, I don't have in front of me that we actually fund them. I mean, you're saying we provide them with assistance?
Yes, as part of the so-called moderate opposition.
Yeah. I don't know what.
Now, the group
again,
also.
I haven't seen the allegations yet, so I think it's too early for me to A, make that assessment, and B, make that connection.
It's been said that the State Department is also investigating allegations. I mean, there's a video of this group beheading a 10-year-old Palestinian boy.
Yeah, I'm aware
how
of
are those investigations going? Has there been any result?
Yeah, so we did talk about that. We were looking into those that incident. Obviously, we condemned if it were true. I know that the group itself said that they had also made some arrests and then set up a commission of inquiry into the incident. I don't have any updates at this point in time, but I can certainly check and get back to you.
So what does a rebel group in Syria have to do to not receive U.S. funds any longer? What is the line that they must cross? What kind of controversial incident must take place for a group to stop receiving U.S. funds?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of vetting.
Blah, 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 blah. So here we see the same old bullshit from the same old bullshitters. And this actual incident, the one that was covered that the reporter was just pressing the spokesperson about, is actually covered by James Corbett here. And it was an incident where a U.S.-supported moderate rebel group beheaded a child. And this group actually was featured in a BBC documentary about how they were freedom fighters. And so I'll give a link here in the show notes page. I'd like to, I could go on for hours and hours and hours with this mainstream media and government lies about war and lying us into war, weapons of mass destruction, but obviously I don't have, all day to recount every single lie that the government has told. So check out the Corbett Report, this video, if you want to get the full scoop on that. Also, a lot of other James Corbett's content, obviously, as he deals a lot with debunking the war lies. So the point at which Orwell, Huxley, and Whitehead come to play with the MSM war lies is that while there is a large part of the population that will believe the lies, and a lie is a truth as long as you keep repeating it, there is still a large portion of the population, in the face of overwhelming and well-documented evidence, still won't listen or believe. And I think this is the Huxley at play. Because for a lot of people, these thoughts about moderate rebel groups that their tax dollars are going to fund, beheading 12-year-old kids, are too distressing to be thought about or troubled with. Why would you want to think about that? Here, have some soma. Or what I would call, bread and games, entertainment, Hollywood, television, those distractions, our modern day soma. But nowhere is this Huxleyan soma distraction more important than in the continuing and largely ignored revelations about unwarranted government spying and surveillance programs. And this is the most frustrating thing that I run into in my own life, that despite repeated and credible revelations about very real NSA, FBI, and CIA panopticon surveillance programs, the American public still refuses to confront the fact that every single aspect of their lives is being surveilled and stored in Utah NSA data facilities.
The war on terror changed the way state and federal agencies conduct investigations. The ever-looming threat of terror lingered on the tongues of the American people, as law enforcement officials attempted to find a way to shine a light into the shadows to prevent the next pending attack. Out of this need sprung a new form of intelligence, electronic surveillance. The government began collecting data by the terabytes and storing it in warehouses to be mulled over at a later date by security analysts and experts. At first, this technology was only for the higher-ups, classified and only spoken of behind closed doors. but eventually state and local authorities would begin getting the equipment themselves in order to investigate alleged terror suspects in their own backyards. Enter the Stingray, a device so secretive, federal and state authorities have signed non-disclosure agreements with one of the makers of the device, Harris Corp., who wouldn't comment or agree for an interview for this documentary. But what is a Stingray? Stingray is a catch-all term for cell site simulators or IMSI catchers. Inside your cell phone is a small chip. This chip helps your phone do multiple tasks at once and helps it communicate with the outside world. A specific part of that chip, the baseband, handles all your phone's communications with cell phone towers. The baseband helps your phone decide which tower to choose in order to have the best possible connection. Your baseband is pretty trusting and will connect to just about any tower in the area. When your baseband chooses a tower, the tower can ask you for your IMSI, also known as your International Mobile Subscriber Identity, which is linked to your billing account. The Stingray acts as a cell tower and tricks your phone into giving its IMSI, and can even tell your phone that it doesn't support encryption, meaning your phone will start broadcasting your calls and texts unencrypted through the airwaves. It can tell your phone to continuously tell it where it is, and worse. Nathan Fried Wessler is a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union. He's been pushing for transparency on surveillance technologies and is one of the foremost experts on the capabilities of stingrays and IMSI catchers.
These difficult and important issues are arising in a whole bunch of contexts. One area I work on a lot is location privacy and location tracking from police. That is enabled by a number of different technologies, from license plate readers, which can be mounted on police cars or stationary utility poles and can snap images of every license plate that goes by and then geotag them and feed them into huge databases, to law enforcement requests to cell phone companies for a person's cell phone location information, either real-time tracking where the phone company is required to send silent pings to the phone to learn where it is over time, or access to historical records that the phone companies store for months or years at a time that can paint a very detailed picture of where somebody has gone and who they've spent time with. And then police use of their own technology that allows cell phone tracking, often called cell site simulators or Stingray devices, which mimic cell phone towers and force not only a suspect's phone, but also bystanders' phones in the area into reporting back their identity and their location. It's like a game of Marco Polo, the kids' pool game. The Stingray device sends out a signal that says, "Hey, Marco, who's in the area?" And then every phone is forced to send back a signal that says, "Oh, Polo, I'm over here. I'm phone 325-62545. And the phone in the next house over says, "Oh, I'm over here too. I'm phone 671-212-131." And every phone in the area keeps on sending back its unique identifying information. And then using those transmissions, the device can very precisely pinpoint the location of phones. And importantly, even when a Stingray device is looking for a particular suspect's phone, in the background, by design, it's also forcing all those bystanders' phones to register in with it as well. But the signals they transmit cross the walls of houses and offices and other private areas protected by the Fourth Amendment. And they can even have the effect of blocking people's cell phone service and causing their calls to drop because this is a fake cell tower. It's not actually connected to the cell phone network. And so if it's tricking a phone into connecting with it, that's often going to be a dead end for any call that the caller is trying to make. This technology, if used in inappropriate ways, can chill people's speech and association, could be used to target dissidents, could be used to surveil protesters. It could be used in the service of a really disturbing police state.
So I uncovered in May about FBI planes flying around American cities, doing surveillance of some kind. And so I published the tail numbers of 100 of these aircraft after tracking back the fact that they were registered to fake companies that didn't exist. These companies were named things like FVX Research or NG Research, things like that seemed really fake. So I looked into those companies. It turned out that they didn't have any presence on Secretary of State websites, and they were simply there for the purpose of registering airplanes. So looking at the tail numbers, where they'd been, they were circling American cities, even places like Disneyland, repeatedly. So I knew it was some kind of surveillance operation. Originally, in my first piece, I wrote that they're probably using Stingray surveillance or other kind of cell phone surveillance. But also I knew about a place, Dayton, Ohio, that had a contract with a private company to do what's called wide area persistent surveillance. So they literally have extremely advanced imaging software that was originally developed for the military in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they can survey an entire city, like 32 square miles, for example, everything moving, like cars, people walking, sometimes even birds. And I knew Dayton, Ohio, because the ACLU and other people had reported on this. Oh, they haven't told me anything, really. Every time I've tried to get data from them, they've come back with, we can't explain what's going on here because it'll divulge too much information that could harm national security. They had told the Associated Press a week after I published my story, and they said that they, on occasion, use Stingray. And they also noted in that they're using this advanced imaging.
My guest today is William Binney, a whistleblower, former National Security Agency official. He was one of the first to reveal the agency's massive domestic spying program. Mr. Binney revealed that NSA sought and received access to telecommunications companies' domestic and international billing records, that it has intercepted somewhere between 15 to 20 trillion communications. Mr. Binney also claims that in order to cover its warrantless surveillance, the agency concealed it under the patriotic-sounding name Terrorist Surveillance Program. Mr. Binney, thank you so much for coming. Does this scandal prove the notion that there is no such thing as privacy in a surveillance state?
Well, yes, that's what I've been basically saying for quite some time, is that the FBI has access to the data collected, which is basically the emails of virtually everybody in the country, and the FBI has access to it. All the congressional members are on this surveillance too. It's not, no one's excluded. They're all included. So yes, this can happen to anyone if they become a target for whatever reason. If they are targeted by the government can go in, or the FBI or other agencies of the government can go into that database, pull all that data they've collected on them over the years, and reanalyze it all. So retroactively analyze everything they've done over the last 10 years at least.
And it's not just about those who could be planning, who could be a threat to national security, but also those who could be just...
It's everybody. I thought the NARIS device simply takes in the entire line. So it takes all the data. In fact, they advertise. The way they advertise, they can process the lines at session rates, which means 10 gigabit lines. That's the NARIS, not the STA6400, but the, I forget the name of it. There's another device that they have that does that, but it does it at 10 gigabits. That's why they're building Bluffdale, because they have to have more storage because they can't figure out what's important. So they're just storing everything there. So all that email is going to be stored there for the future. But right now it's stored in different places around the country. But it is being collected and FBI has access to it.
You mean it's being collected in bulk without even requesting the provider?
Mark Klein, in his declarations in the court about the AT&T facility in San Francisco, documented the NSA room inside that AT&T facility where they had NARIS devices to collect data off the fiber optic lines inside the United States. So that's kind of a powerful device that would collect everything that was being sent. It could collect on the order of over 100 billion 1,000 character emails a day, one device. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the kind of collection that's going on.
And we pick up on the continuing fallout from the revelations of former NSA contractor Edward Snowden. Last night, we debated the role of the Foreign Surveillance Intelligence Court, which approves the government's request to gather intelligence information on Americans. Tonight, we have a conversation with 3 former NSA officials, a former inspector general and 2 NSA veterans who blew the whistle on what they say were abuses and mismanagement at the secret government intelligence agency. William Binney worked at the NSA for over 3 decades as a mathematician, where he designed systems for collecting and analyzing large amounts of data. He retired in 2001. Russell Tice had a 2-decade career with the NSA, where he focused on collection and analysis. He says he was fired in 2005 after calling on Congress to provide greater protection to whistleblowers. He claims the NSA tapped the phone of high-level government officials and the news media 10 years ago.
The United States were, at that time, using satellites to spy on American citizens. At that time, it was news organizations, the State Department, including Colin Powell, and an awful lot of senior military people and industrial types.
So this is the early 2000s?
This was in 2002, 2003 timeframe. The NSA were targeting individuals. In that case, they were judges like the Supreme Court. I held in my hand Judge Alito's targeting information for his phones and his staff and his family.
Bill Binney, what was your sense of who was being targeted and why they were being targeted, and what was being collected, in other words?
Well, I wasn't aware of specific targeting like Russ was, but I just saw the inputs were including hundreds of millions of records of phone calls of U.S. citizens every day. So it was there wasn't anybody who wasn't a part of this collection of information. So virtually you could target anybody in the country you wanted.
Both Binney and Tice suspect that today the NSA is doing more than just collecting metadata on calls made in the U.S. They both point to this CNN interview by former FBI counterterrorism agent Tim Clementi, days after the Boston Marathon bombing. Clementi was asked if the government had a way to get the recordings of the calls between Tamerlan Tsarnaev and his wife.
On the national security side of the house, in the federal government, we have assets. There's lots of assets at our disposal throughout the intelligence community, and also not just domestically but overseas. Those assets allow us to gain information and intelligence on things that we can't use ordinarily in a criminal investigation. All digital communications there's a way to look at digital communications in the past. And I can't go into detail of how that's done or what's done, but I can tell you that no digital communication is secure.
Tice says after he saw this interview on television, he called some former workmates at the NSA.
Well, 2 months ago, I contacted some colleagues at NSA. We had a little meeting, and the question came up, was NSA collecting everything now? Because we kind of figured that was the goal all along. And the answer came back was yes, they're collecting everything, content, word for word, everything of every domestic communication in this country.
Both of you know what the...
If you trust the government is going to do the right thing, I think you're alone in that respect.
In November 2015, the National Security Agency lost the ability to directly hold information about the phone calls of millions of U.S. citizens. This was all thanks to the USA Freedom Act passed last summer. But don't get too comfortable. While the change is significant, the NSA can still collect and store your communication from the internet and social media. So all those selfies you've been taking and all those online chats with friends, yeah, the NSA may have them stored up somewhere. It's hard to say where they store them, but in the future they'll be stored here in these nondescript concrete buildings in the sleepy town of Bluffdale, Utah. We asked the NSA if they could show us around the complex, but were promptly turned down because the site is a secure facility. They may have understandably been a little spooked since Edward Snowden revealed all that spying on Americans that they were involved in.
The NSA data center is primarily server space, where they have large rooms with racks of servers.
That's Pete Ashton of X-Mission, an internet service provider in Salt Lake City. Before Snowden revealed massive spying by the NSA in 2013, Ashton was able to get a tour of what was inside those concrete buildings, and he may be one of the only people to talk about what he saw publicly.
What did you see? How did you even get an invitation to go?
X-Mission is part of Utah Data Center Consortium, which was started by an individual at the University of Utah. University of Utah, of course, has their own data center, and they wanted to get people together to share ideas and best practices. The Data Center Consortium includes University of Utah, eBay, Oracle, and it also includes the NSA. And I think the NSA participates, just to be friendly and probably to recruit, because whenever there's a thing at the University of Utah where we're talking data centers, they go up and they want to talk to the students to tell them what they do and what a great job it is to work for the NSA. So they made that invitation in fall of 2012, and I heard it was a great facility and I wanted to check it out.
So you walk in, and what do you walk around and see on this tour?
It was still under construction at that point, and I saw a lot of people pulling cable. They loaded us into a van and drove us around. First we saw the facility kind of like from above, and they pointed out how it's divided into two facilities that are redundant with each other. The questions they would answer were very banal, but we were able to calculate the capacity just by counting the generators. Each of those generators was like a 2 megawatt generator, and they had over 30 of them, I think.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of power.
It is a huge amount of power. I think a megawatt can service 1,000 homes.
The tour guide said that one of the reasons they wanted to build the data center in Utah was because of the patriotism of people from Utah.
Yeah, that was one of my questions is, why did you come here? And his response was, the electricity is cheap and the people are patriotic. And I read that as a code word, is that nobody's going to ask any questions. And, that kind of sat with me uneasily, that in my opinion, patriotism is questioning your government consistently. The idea that we're just sheep out here and we're not going to care, I think is, even though we're a very conservative state, I think a lot of people would bristle at that idea. That was something else that was interesting about the tour is I asked, well, where's your internet connection? Do you have a connection to the internet at all? And they said, this building is not connected to the internet. So they have intercept points around the country that I think they pull data off of those intercept points and put them on their own private network. They definitely have fiber going into that building, but I think it's completely air-gapped from the internet. I started to realize that it's just a data collection point, that they're collecting and storing as much data off the internet and telephone networks that they can. And they think that if you ask for a warrant later to look at the data, that's okay.
Even with everything that Snowden revealed, do you think that the average American really understands bulk data collection from the NSA?
Absolutely not. I think it's a very hard thing for most Americans to understand exactly that their data is being intercepted and stored.
So with all these revelations, I think it is clear that we have already reached the complete surveillance society that George Orwell warned about in his book 1984, and that John W. Whitehead discusses at length in this book. And it is very frustrating that the American public either refuses to accept this fact or just doesn't understand the true extent of what this actually means and what is actually going on. Furthermore, and I don't think that this is something that Orwell could have predicted, but the American public is so willfully ignorant of these revelations that they would actually go out and gladly purchase and install their own surveillance equipment in and around their persons and in their own home. And this happens in the form of cell phones, smart meters, smart TVs, and Amazon Alexas, where the price of freedom is asking whether or not cats can eat pancakes.
Talk about an Orwellian nightmare. Problem is, this isn't a dream. We've been warning you for years about these so-called smart devices like Alexa or the Echo, which have been specifically designed to spy on you for the purposes of both advertising and for control. And now we have the definitive proof, as Amazon and Google have just been caught filing patents to do just that. A bombshell report from Consumer Watchdog has recently been released, exposing an Orwellian nightmare that's unfolding right before our eyes. Google Amazon patent filings reveal digital home assistant privacy problems. A new study reveals that Amazon and Google have filed patent applications for a number of technologies that would dramatically expand surveillance of consumers' private lives. These patent applications show how technology companies use home data to draw disturbing inferences about households and how the companies might use that data for financial gain. Some of these technologies detailed in this patent include a system for deriving sentiments and behaviors from ambient speech, even when a user has not addressed the device's wake word. Remember when Amazon's Echo came out? Well, one thing you certainly didn't know at that time was in 2014, the company had patented an algorithm that could listen to human speech, including phone conversations, for statements of interest like, "I love skiing." The algorithm would then process the statements into keywords that could be used to target advertising. I've already personally experienced this myself a number of times. For example, I recently bought a car, which in BC where I live, it requires snow tires in order to be road legal. I didn't Google it, I've never typed it in, I've never typed it out anywhere. I only had one conversation on the phone with my mom where I mentioned that I'm going to need to buy snow tires in order to get the car certified. Lo and behold, approximately 48 hours later, I began to get flooded with ads to buy snow tires in my area. This new Facebook advertising tab still shows me winter tires for sale, even though I already bought them.
This is how your smart TV spies on you. WikiLeaks' latest documents allege the CIA developed a secret hacking program that can turn smart TVs into bugging devices. Smart TVs are often equipped with cameras, microphones, and internal memories, and can connect to the internet. WikiLeaks says the CIA's Weeping Angel hack can place the smart TV in fake off mode, leading the owner to believe the TV is off when it's actually on. The TV then operates as a bug. It is able to secretly record conversations through the camera and microphone and send the files to a CIA server. Samsung's F8000 series smart TVs were allegedly hacked by the CIA. Vizio, which has sold more than 11 million smart TVs since 2010, was fined $2.2 million last month after it was found to have been tracking audience habits without asking permission first. LG's current smart TVs do not collect user data, but the older models do.
In the age of smart appliances, internet-connected refrigerators and Bluetooth-ready microwaves might just be convenient enough that the last thing on our minds is that these very appliances could be dropping eaves on our private conversations. But if you happen to own one of these, a Samsung Smart TV, you may already be victim of unwarranted home surveillance. That's right. According to the company's own privacy policy, the conversations you're having in the confines of your own home may not always be private. The message reads, quote, "Please be aware that if your spoken words include personal or other sensitive information, that information will be among the data captured and transmitted to a third party through your use of voice recognition." And while it remains unclear who or what that third party is, the broad wording in the privacy agreement is enough to raise some eyebrows among the civil liberties community. Consider this, for instance, that in 2012, a team of researchers from a firm called Rovoln, based in Malta, managed to hack a similar smart TV and access the device's built-in camera and microphones, effectively turning TV viewers into the ones being watched. In a video, the company's hackers added that quote, "We can install malicious software to gain complete root access to the TV." But look, while the voice control feature is certainly an added convenience for anyone beyond the archaic use of a remote control, it's officially time to consider that there's now the possibility that your conversations about everything from unpaid parking tickets to sex habits and any potential recreational drug use could be sold to an undisclosed third party. I guess in simpler terms, we can think of it this way. If you own a smart TV, it might be a smart idea to start watching what you say around it, or at least reconsider that second smart set for the bedroom. Manuel Rapalo, RT Studios, Washington.
So if you can actually get the average American to confront the reality of the panopticon-like surveillance society that they've sleptwalked into, they might confront you with something like, "So what? Big deal. I don't mind if my information is shared with the government or fascistic governmental corporations. I have nothing to hide." Or they might confront you with my personal favorite, which is, "If you haven't broken the law, you have nothing to worry about." Well, rest assured, the government may not currently have the logistics to listen to everything in real time, or to predict crime, and that's coming. Everyone should be rest assured that the day is quickly approaching where everyone will fear to whisper in their own house, lest they get a midnight visit from the Stasi or the Gestapo. And let me tell you that those who would actually support police state policies or police brutality are all either sociopaths or indoor cats who have never actually had to deal with the police or have ever been suspected of a crime. Some members of the American public might actually accept the reality of this panopticon surveillance grid, and they might ask, well, why would the government do this? What are they going to possibly do with all of our personal information? And that, folks, is where Aldous Huxley comes in. The government wants to control and condition you. They want to control what you're thinking about, what your desires are, and they want to know, most importantly for their political purposes, what can they get away with? But moreover, folks, the end game is more complex, terrifying, and all-enveloping than you could probably imagine.
Are you starting to see some of the linkage right now between this move to the post-carbon world and the post-carbon economy and the monopolization of the next tool of control, just as oil was a tool of control that the oligarchs wielded to further consolidate their power and control over society, so too is data and all things technocratic being used in the service of that same agenda. And don't take my word for it. Take the word of everyone's favorite billionaire eugenicist and data oligarch, Bill Gates, who has just announced his own plan to create his own desert mega smart city of the future, not in Saudi Arabia, but in the good old US of A.
All right, check this out. If Bill Gates gets his way, Arizona could be home to a brand new cutting-edge smart city. A real estate investment firm owned by the computer billionaire recently bought a giant plot of land in the far West Valley for $80 million. The company bought 25,000 acres in Tonopah. That's about 50 miles west of Phoenix. They're supposed to call the new city Belmont. And the plans include space for 80,000 homes, nearly 500 acres for public schools. They apparently want to fill the city with driverless cars, data centers, and digital networks. The proposed I-11 freeway would connect the Belmont area to Las Vegas. Gates would like the city to be about the same size and population, apparently, of Tempe. No word on when the project will begin.
Now, I imagine I don't have to work too hard to connect the dots here for my regular viewers and listeners, namely those dots connecting this idea of these smart cities where everything will be networked and tracked and surveilled and databased in the Internet of Things that is constantly taking tabs of you and everything that you own and what you are doing and who you are interacting with. And the dot over here, where people are living in a completely controlled technocratic police state, I think those things go together quite obviously. This is one of those topics, like so many other topics that I cover at the Corporate Report, that cannot be isolated or contained like a specimen in a petri dish. It expands outward and encompasses so many other related topics and subtopics that it becomes overwhelming, perhaps intentionally so. This isn't just about smart appliances. This is about smart, networked everything and the entire reordering of society that is implied by this revolution that we are currently undergoing. This is about the cashless society. This is about driverless cars. This is about 5G millimeter wave cellular networks. This is about nationwide facial recognition databases that themselves are tied into nationwide facial scanning camera networks. This is about the biometric identification control grid. Ultimately, this is going to be about autonomous weapons and drones and artificial intelligence and all of these crazy technologies that are just coming into view now. And as I say, it's such a vast topic that it is overwhelming. No single person can possibly understand or encompass it all. But it is important to understand that all of these technologies are resting on an infrastructure that is being put into place right now. And that infrastructure is understandable, at least in its broad outlines. That is the smart grid that is being slotted in right now. And it is interesting to see this formation of the smart grid that will be the infrastructure upon which the superstructure of the technocratic police state will be erected. It's interesting to see the parallels between that smart grid infrastructure going into place and the infrastructure that came in the late 19th, early 20th century that codified the oil industry into society. The way that our society is now built around the oil industry and its byproducts, to the point where our cities are literally engineered around the roadways that are carrying the cars, which of course are fueled by the gasoline, which comes from the petrochemicals. This is all a system that didn't just exist. It wasn't just there. All of this infrastructure was created and put in through a concerted effort over a period of decades, as I outlined, at least in part, in how big oil conquered the world. And now we are seeing the laying of the infrastructure for the 21st century equivalent of the oil commodity, which shaped the early 20th century society. Now, in the early 21st century, we're seeing the society being shaped around the new commodity, data, and everything that implies. This is a coordinated global campaign that is ongoing right now to sell the public on this great new thing that's going to transform our world and is going to be the thing that our society depends on. In the 20th century, it was oil. In the 21st century, it's data. And more specifically, the things that can be done with oil, the things that can be done with data. And those are going to be the products that they sell to us as we happily buy our way into our own enslavement in the technocratic police state control grid. It is a mind-boggling picture, an overwhelming one, and a very intimidating one, because it seems extremely difficult to imagine how lowly people like ourselves at the bottom rung of this power pyramid can possibly fight back against such a coordinated control grid system. But there are things that we can take away about things that we can actually do in our life to start combating this agenda, even as it is still being sold to the public, even as most of the public is still but dimly aware of these technologies that are coming into view and the smart grid that underlies it. There are already people working on ways that we can undermine this agenda.
Okay, so thanks for bearing with me through what was a pretty long Corbett clip, but I felt it was necessary to really get the gist of what the technocratic police state control grid really is, and what the end game is, and how we can fight it. And like Corbett alluded to, I know that the overwhelming question burning in your mind right now is, well, what can I do? Or what can we do? And that is a question that I'm still trying to answer myself. But for me, it was starting the Liberty Weekly podcast and creating videos like this and trying to spread the messages of liberty. And my friends and I at the Libertarian Union are trying to do just that. But one definite step is to educate yourself by picking up A Government of Wolves by John W. Whitehead. And as I stated earlier in the podcast, every major theme that I've hit up here is presented in greater detail in that book, and it's done very well. Now, although I have quibbles with him, I will leave the audience with the words of Samuel Adams, and that is, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men." So that being said, the absolute best way to help aid me in this journey is to share this documentary and to share the Liberty Weekly podcast far and wide with all of your friends and family and impress onto them how important this struggle is. But also, you can subscribe to the Liberty Weekly podcast either on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. Another good way to keep track of the videos that I put out is by subscribing to the Liberty Weekly podcast on YouTube at youtube.com/Liberty Weekly, or better yet, BitChute, which is a decentralized peer-to-peer video platform. I'm also there at bitchute.com/Liberty Weekly. Also, obviously, the Corbett Report, whom I've cited and relied on in this documentary. Lots of good information for you there at CorbettReport.com. And show a lot of love to my buddies at the Libertarian Union. You can get there by navigating to libertarianunion.com. As always, if you find the work that I'm doing here at the Liberty Weekly podcast to be valuable, I would encourage you to head on over to patreon.com/Liberty Weekly and become a patron of the show. Patreon supporters get access to a cache of bonus content, which is backlogged as well, and that includes bloopers, extras, warm-up recordings, in some cases early access. There's hyperlinked transcripts, also copies of our ebooks. There's also access to the Liberty Weekly meme repository curated by myself and Daniel from the Actual Anarchy podcast. And there's also access to the Rothbard repository, which is a collection of searchable Murray Rothbard lectures, and that's a great resource, let me tell you. And in fact, I think I'm going to put together a little bloopers reel from the filming of this podcast episode, so I think that will be amusing. In fact, Patreon supporters have gone a long way towards helping me cover my hosting costs for the Libsyn podcast hosting, as well as help me invest in better equipment, including the webcam through which you've viewed this podcast. So if you find my work to be valuable, I would encourage you to do that. But all in all, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this documentary, and I will be back this week with more content, especially a great conversation that I had in person with Trey from the Subversion webcast. We met up yesterday and recorded a big, long conversation. We did a video as well, so look for that on the Liberty Weekly YouTube page as well. But that's all for me, Patrick McFarland, signing out. Have a great week, everyone.